How should white unpin the bishop? 1. King g1 f1, or 1. With a rook move? Incorrect. Moving away, 1. King g1 f1 gets the white king off the g-file, ending the pin of the g8 rook on the bishop. With the bishop no longer pinned, it can shift into gear and take black's rook at c6. But black has a free move. He can extricate the rook quite easily, and so white isn't able to win anything. Breaking the pin in this way, by taking the time to move the king, is simply too slow to succeed. Correct. It's a rook move that does the trick, and an absurd-looking one at that. 1. Rook h7, h8. White puts an end to the g-file pin by diverting black's rook off the g-file, sacrificing his own rook in the corner. Note that a pinned piece can't move for actual or practical reasons, in that it shields another piece, or important square, behind it along the line of attack. After white's rook moves to h8, black essentially has two choices, both of which fail. He can take white's rook, or he can protect his rook at g8. If he takes white's rook, 1. Rook g8 takes h8, the pin on the g-file has ceased to be, and the bishop can then take the c6 rook for nothing. 2. Bishop g2 takes c6. This capture happens to turn the pinning concept around, for it suddenly puts the knight in a pin. The knight can't move because it shields black's king from the bishop's attack. Since the knight is attacked twice, by white's rook and bishop, and since black can't add a second protector to the knight, only the king can defend it, the steed is lost. Instead of taking the rook, 1. Rook g8 takes h8. Black might try to guard his own rook, say 1. Knight d7 f6. But this doesn't help, for white just trades rooks on g8. 2. Rook h8 takes g8, check. Knight f6 takes g8, terminating the pin quite effectively by destroying the pinner. With the pin gone, the bishop is then capable of removing the rook on c6. 3. Bishop g2 takes c6, check, for free. White comes away with a decisive material gain in either case. Which rook should white take? The rook at g6 or the rook at g8? Correct. Taking the rook at g6, 1. f5 takes g6, is the winning capture. There's a roadblock, however, for black initially keeps the game even by taking white's rook, 1. Rook g8 takes h8. But with one pin over and done with, black's original pin on the g-file, white can create a pin of his own. He can move the bishop to c6, 2. Bishop g2 c6, and black's d7 knight is indefensible. White thereby gains a piece. Incorrect. Exchanging rooks on g8, 1. Rook h8 takes g8, check. Rook g6 takes g8, adds nothing, for white's bishop is still pinned along the g-file and can't move. However, white continues, whether he ends the pin, or checks black's king, or whatever, black will have little trouble avoiding the possibility of a pin along the a4, e8 diagonal. For example, he can simply move his king up to e7. Which knight should black move? The one on g4 or the one on b4? Incorrect. Black, as an illustration, can save his g4 knight by moving it to e5, 1 knight g4 e5, though the pin on the h3 pawn, black's h8 rook to white's h1 rook, dissuades white from taking the knight anyway. If 2 h3 takes g4, then 2 rook h8 takes h1 check. After the repositioning, 1 knight g4 e5, black has a fine game, but the material is even. And since from the original position he has a way to gain, this can't be the right way to go. Correct. It's black's queen knight that can do the damage, by brashly capturing on c2 with check. 1 knight b4 takes c2 check. This also forks the rook at a1, so white has nothing better than taking the knight with his queen. 2 queen e2 takes c2. But recapturing on c2 reduces the number of defenders on b5 by 1, and it also puts the c3 knight in a pin. The knight can't move productively because it's shielding white's queen from capture by the c8 rook. So black takes the b5 bishop, 2 bishop d7 takes b5, and white's c3 knight can't safely take back. Note that in the end, black's g4 knight still can't be taken because the h3 pawn remains pinned. Black has won a pawn. How should black save his queen? A bishop pin or a rook pin? Incorrect. The diagonal pin 1 bishop e7 c5 is messy. True, it saves the queen by pinning the d4 bishop to white's king along the a7 g1 diagonal, but it's costly. For after white takes the c5 bishop, 2 bishop d4 takes c5, he has an assemblage of 3 minor pieces against black's 2 rooks, which is approximate material equality. Obviously, the creation of this material imbalance makes the assessment of the position problematic. Sometimes 2 rooks are better than 3 minor pieces. Sometimes the 3 minor pieces outmaneuver the rooks. Why go into a nebulous situation when black has clearer and better? Correct. The pin 1 rook a8 d8 gets ready to answer the capture of black's queen. 2 bishop d4 takes a1. With the counter capture of white's, 2 rook d8 takes d1 check. After this proposed trade of queens, black is cleaning up. So white has to try to close the d-file with 2 bishop c4 d5. And this obstruction renews the threat to black's queen. But black clears the air with the annihilating 2 rook d8 takes d5, giving up the exchange, a rook for a minor piece, to get control of the position. White can take back 3 e4 takes d5, but now with a2 no longer protected by the non-existent light square bishop, black's queen can escape at a2. 3 queen a1 takes a2. The resulting position has black ahead by the exchange and 3 pawns, which is usually a winning advantage wherever chess is played. Should black chase the b5 knight or threaten mate, 1 a7 a6, or 1 queen d8 b6? Incorrect. Trying to drive the knight back by using the a pawn is a blunder. After 1 a7 a6, white doesn't have to withdraw the knight. Instead, he can invoke the crushing rejoinder 2 knight b5 takes d6 check, exploiting the g5 bishop's pin on the e7 pawn. If the e-pawn moves, it exposes the black queen to capture from g5, but black doesn't have a choice. He has to take the knight to save his king. So there follows 2 e7 takes d6, enabling white to take black's queen. 3 bishop g5 takes d8. White laughs all the way to the chess bank. Correct. Black is advised to unpin his e7 pawn by moving his queen off the d8 h4 diagonal. This he can do with a gain of time by going to knight 3, 1 queen d8 b6, which threatens a queen mate at f2, supported by the g4 knight. It also clears d8 for black's king, if it should need a flight square. It won't, however, not after moving the queen to b6. Should black move the knight or the rook? Incorrect. It doesn't matter where black moves the knight. He's going to have trouble. If he retreats it to f6 or h6, white's king can take the rook at h2 for free. He could try the counterattack 1 knight g4 e5, menacing white's queen and hoping to avoid capture by the d-pawn, which is pinned to white's king by the queen at b6. But white has several answers that gain material. He can break the pin with 2 queen d3 e3, and after 2 knight e5 c4, withdraw his queen to e2, 3 queen e3 e2, when both black's rook and knight are attacked and undefended. Or white could simply play 2 rook e1 takes e5, sacrificing his rook, knowing that after black takes it, 2 d6 takes e5, white then garners black's rook, 3 king g1 takes h2. In the end, white comes out a piece ahead. By the way, what kind of sacrifice is it if you know that by sacrificing you're going to win? This 2 rook e1 takes e5 is not a real sacrifice, but rather a pseudo-sacrifice, or a sacrifice in name only. Correct. Black has several rook moves that are worthy of note. For one, he could disengage the rook from attack by withdrawing it to h5. Then, if white takes black's knight, 2 f3 takes g4, black's rook takes the white knight, 2 rook h5 takes g5, and it's all even. But why play an okay move when you have much better? Black can punish white's carelessness by 1 rook h2 h1 check. To this there is only one response: to take the rook, 2 king g1 takes h1, whereupon black's knight enters at f2, 2 knight g4 f2 check, forking white's king and queen. After the king moves to safety, say 3 king h1 h2, the knight takes the queen, 3 knight f2 takes d3, and black has gained a queen for a rook. Which piece should white take, the bishop or the queen? Correct. White wins a piece by taking the bishop with check. 1 bishop b3 takes f7 check. Black can't retake with his rook. 1 rook f8 takes f7, for that hangs the queen. 2 queen d1 takes d8 check. So black's king must do its own dirty work. 1 king g8 takes f7, which meets up with the checking fork. 2 queen d1 b3 check. Wherever black moves his king, he loses at least his bishop to white's queen. 3. Queen b3 takes b4. I say at least because he could make the mistake of moving the king to f6. 2. King f7 f6, allowing mate. 3. Queen b3 e6, checkmate. Incorrect. Taking the queen, 1. Queen d1 takes d8, merely leads to a trade. 1. Rook f8 takes d8. Whether white then trades bishops or not, 2. Bishop b3 takes f7 check, king g8 takes f7, he will certainly have to make provisions for his attacked rook, spending a tempo to get it to safety. Black is holding his own. Which is the better piece for white to take, the rook or the bishop? Incorrect. Taking the rook, 1. Rook a1 takes a8, may seem to win a piece, for after black takes back, 1. Bishop c6 takes a8, white trades bishops on g7, 2. Bishop b2 takes g7, king h7 takes g7, and then gives a queen check at a1, 3. Queen c1 a1 check, forking the black king and bishop at a8. After black gets out of check, 3. King g7 h7, white wins the bishop. 4. Queen a1 takes a8. But it doesn't go this way. After white captures the rook, 1. Rook a1 takes a8. Black doesn't take it back yet. Instead, he interposes a bishop capture. 1. Bishop g7 takes b2, which also attacks white's queen. Assuming the queen takes back, 2. Queen c1 takes b2, then black retakes on a8. 2. Bishop c6 takes a8. At this point, white's queen can still shift to a1, hitting the a bishop. But that's all the queen attacks, for black's king is not on g7, so it's not check, and white doesn't win anything. Trading is not winning. Trading is getting the same as you give up. Winning is getting more than you give up, while losing is getting less than you give up. Correct. The winning move is to take black's g7 bishop, 1. Bishop b2 takes g7 first. If black's king takes back, 1. King h7 takes g7, then white trades rooks. 2. Rook a1 takes a8, bishop c6 takes a8, and follows with a forking queen check. 3. Queen c1 a1 check. After black ends the check, 3. King g7 h7, white takes the queen bishop for nothing. 4. Queen a1 takes a8. And if black tries to save himself by answering 1. Bishop b2 takes g7 with the interposition 1. Rook a8 takes a1, white has two ways to emerge a piece ahead. He can take back with his queen, 2. Queen c1 takes a1, which winds up protecting the bishop at g7, preventing black's king from taking it, or he could just come backward, taking the rook with the g7 bishop. 2. Bishop g7 takes a1, getting it out of danger before black's king can take it. Should black develop the king knight or the queen knight? 1. Knight g8 h6, or 1. Knight b8 c6. Incorrect. If black develops the king knight, he has but one move, 1. Knight g8 h6, for h6 is the only unblocked square available. Unfortunately for black, this enables white to unleash a devilish double attack. 2. Queen d1 c1. Suddenly, black's h6 knight is threatened by two white pieces, a battery of the d2 bishop and the c1 queen. Meanwhile, white's queen also menaces the c8 bishop, which is not guarded at all. Black must lose one of them, either the h6 knight or the c8 bishop. Few defenders can dance at 2 weddings at the same time. Correct. Activating the queen knight, one knight b8 c6, is a fine idea, and it doesn't entail any new problems. It also closes the c-file against white's major pieces, and it enables the a8 rook to protect the c8 bishop. Black still must solve his kingside development, but at least he builds the queenside part of his game without losing anything, and there's a lot to be said for this. Should black take the knight or move his rook? 1. Bishop e5 takes d4, or move his rook. Incorrect. Taking the knight, 1. Bishop e5 takes d4, is only a trade, for white takes back with the bishop. 2. Bishop b2 takes d4. White's game is quite okay after the exchange. Of course, taking back with the rook, 2. Rook d2 takes d4, loses the bishop to black's rook. 2. Rook b5 takes b2 check. After this wrong recapture, white's game is not okay. Correct. Black should move his rook. But where? He'd like to win on d4, but this square is held up by 2 of white's pieces, the bishop and the rook. The answer is to remove both of them with one shot. Black uses his rook to capture the bishop. 1. Rook b5 takes b2. This destroys one of d4's protectors. The other guard, the rook at d2, is lured out of position when it takes back on b2. 2. Rook d2 takes b2. If we assess things at this point, black has sacrificed the exchange, a rook for a bishop. But this is not the end of the story, for the d4 knight is unguarded. So black takes it for free. 2. Bishop e5 takes d4 check, and with a check to boot. After white gets out of check, the bishop takes the rook on b2 for free. The aftermath is that black winds up a bishop ahead. Which way should white castle, kingside or queenside? Correct. Castling kingside, 1 castle kingside, is quite reasonable, and it's safe. Black can then develop the queen bishop, attacking white's queen by 1 bishop c8 g4. But this can be answered adequately by shifting the queen a square over. 2 queen f3 g3. Thereafter, white will probably regain the lost time by moving the king-rook pawn to h3 to drive away the presumptuous bishop. Incorrect. Castling queenside, 1 castle queenside, though often attractive, turns out to be a mistake here, for black's queen bishop develops to g4, skewering white's queen and rook. 1 bishop c8 g4. After white moves his queen to safety, 2 queen f3 g3, black wins the exchange, a rook for a bishop, by taking on d1. 2 bishop g4 takes d1. Note the difference between a pin and a skewer. Generally, both tactics require 1 friendly unit, the attacker, and 2 enemy units, the defenders. All 3 units occupy the same line, either the same rank, the same file, or the same diagonal. A pin prevents the first enemy unit from moving off the line of attack, because this unit shields from capture the enemy unit behind. A skewer does essentially the opposite. Rather than preventing a piece from moving, it practically compels it to do so, which exposes the enemy unit behind it to capture. Another way to view it is with regard to the value of the two attacked enemy units. In a pin, usually the less valuable enemy unit comes first in line, and the more valuable one comes second, shielded from capture by its associate. In a skewer, it's the more valuable unit that appears first in line. It must get out of the way to save itself, thereby exposing the less valuable unit to capture. Regardless whether it's a pin or a skewer, try to do it to your opponent, and don't let it happen to you. Should black develop his king-knight or threaten mate? 1. Knight g8 f6 or 1. Queen d6 c6? Correct. Developing the king-knight, 1. Knight g8 f6, attacks the center and especially observes the squares d5 and e4. It also brings black a step closer to castling kingside, which he'll be able to do after completing the fianchetto of his king-bishop, bishop f8 g7. Finally, it sets up an insidious double attack possibility. If white lets his guard down, black can transfer his queen to c6. This will threaten mate at g2, as well as the capture of the c4 bishop, so one of the two will have to go unanswered. Incorrect. Threatening mate by 1. Queen d6 c6 loses material, though initially it may seem attractive, for in addition to the mate threat, black also eyes the capture of the c4 bishop. But white confutes both attacks with one play, by putting the bishop in the way at d5, 2 bishop c4 d5. This deals with the mate threat by shutting out black's queen, actually driving it away. Worse than this, however, is that the bishop at d5, protected by the knight at c3, skewers black's queen and b7 bishop. After the queen compulsorily moves to safety, white wins the bishop for free. 3 bishop d5 takes b7. It was only a bystander anyway. How should white take back on d4? 1. Queen c4 takes d4, or 1. e3 takes d4. Correct. Taking with the queen, 1. Queen c4 takes d4, is the more prudent of the two possibilities. It's true that the capture moves the queen again, at least for the third time, but it does threaten black's bishop at g4. This serves to remove Her Majesty from the vulnerable c-file without losing a tempo. Besides, it's better to be safe than sorry. Sometimes you have to make concessions, anticipating and warding off your opponent's future threats before they become current problems. Incorrect. Capturing on d4 with the pawn, 1. e3 takes d4, drops material. Black retaliates with 1. Rook a8 c8, which attacks white's queen as well as the c1 bishop behind it. This is a skewer, and there's no way that white can move his queen to safety without exposing the bishop to black's c8 rook. Before taking on d4, white should have looked ahead and foreseen this looming threat. Should black take a pawn or check? 1. Rook a4 takes h4, or 1. Rook a4 a1 check? Incorrect. Black can gain a pawn by taking on h4, 1. Rook a4 takes h4, but this gives white some chances to stay in the game. He might, for instance, be able to establish his bishop on the a1-h8 diagonal, say by going to e5 and then f6, if necessary or desirable, hoping somehow to sneak his rook around to h8 to render mate. This is not a forced possibility, but it gives white a purpose for living. If you have a lost position and you don't intend to resign, you should develop a strategy that helps you maintain the fight. You might, for example, look for ways to cause your opponent difficulties. If there are roadblocks to be set, it's always possible that he might fail to get around or through them. Another thing to think about are possible checkmates, mates that can be conceived with the forces you have available. Even if, in the current position, your opponent can defend against these contingencies by staying mindfully attentive, you might still catch your opponent if he lets his guard down. If you don't try to set him up, hoping for him to go wrong, what's the point of continuing at all? Finally, whatever the circumstances on the board, whether you're winning, losing, or drawing, there's a proper strategy. Find it and use it for guidance. Correct. Checking along the back rank, 1, rook a4, a1 check, is a killer. Not because it wins the rook at g1, it doesn't, for the g1 rook is guarded by the h2 bishop, but rather because it forces white's king to the second rank. After 2 king d1 c2, black skewers king and bishop by 2 rook a1 a2 check. White will have to move his king out of check, and black's rook captures the bishop for free. Should black move his knight or bishop? 1 knight e6 g5 or 1 bishop d5 f3 check? Incorrect. Moving the knight, 1 knight e6 g5, reveals a pernicious threat. To protect a bishop check at f3 that skewers white's king and queen while also threatening mate. So even if white were to remove his queen from the d1 h5 diagonal by going to c2, 2 queen d1 c2, black still ices the enemy by 2 bishop d5 f3 checkmate. But white can save himself with the counterattacking advance 2 e3 e4. This blocks out black's bishop altogether, while gaining time by threatening to capture it. And if the bishop retreats to c6, 2 bishop d5 c6, white should still be kicking after 3 b2 b3, protecting the knight at a4 and more or less holding the fort. Correct. The crusher is 1 bishop d5 f3 check. This is a sacrifice, and it must be accepted. 2 king e2 takes f3, for the bishop skewers white's king and queen. Besides, white doesn't have another legal move. However, after the bishop is taken by the king, black has yet another skewer, transferring the queen from one edge to the other. 2 queen a5 h5 check, and this one leaves white crestfallen. After the king gets out of check, say 3 king f3 g2, black captures white's queen, 3 queen h5 takes d1 for free. Actually, it could end up even worse than this if white flees the check by scurrying his king up to e4, 3 king f3 e4. This brash response is disposed of by 3 queen h5 f5 checkmate, which is mate, for d4 is guarded by black's knight. Should white capture the knight or advance the c-pawn one square? 1 bishop a4 takes c6 or 1 c2 c3? Correct. Taking the knight, 1 bishop a4 takes c6, is tactically on the money. No matter how black takes back, let's say he takes back with the d-pawn, 1 d7 takes c6. White on the next move will be able to swipe the king-pawn, 2 knight f3 takes e5, without consequence. This is because by taking the knight on move 1, White has undermined the king-pawn support. This kind of tactic is also known as removing the guard, or removing the defender. Incorrect. Advancing the queen-bishop pawn to c3, 1 c2 c3, is a fairly typical move in similar situations. It not only prepares for the two-square advance of White's d-pawn, it also gives the a4 bishop a retreat, if it should need one. Nevertheless, here it is a perfunctory play, which doesn't take into account a sudden opportunity. Black's king-pawn is inadequately protected, and by removing the guard, 1 bishop a4 takes c6, White can win it, 2 knight f3 takes e5. Even a good move, 1 c2 c3, can be rendered bad when there's something clearly better, 1 bishop a4 takes c6. Should black take a knight or attack one? 1 bishop b4 takes c3, or 1 h5 h4. Correct. White's king-pawn is attacked twice, by the queen and b7 bishop, and defended 3 times, by the queen and 2 knights. But this superiority can be overturned by capturing on c3, 1 bishop b4 takes c3, which removes one of the king-pawn supporters. After White takes back, 2 rook c1 takes c3, or even 2 b2 takes c3, Black then drives away another protector, the g3 knight, by advancing the h-pawn to h4, 2 h5 h4. The knight can intrude on the 5th rank, 3 knight g3 f5, attacking Black's queen, but Black can counter by taking the king-pawn, 3 queen e7 takes e4. This capture also menaces mate at g2, since the queen is diagonally supported by the b7 bishop. To stave off mate and simultaneously save his hanging queen, White will have to trade queens, leaving Black a pawn ahead for the endgame. Incorrect. This advance, 1 h5 h4, does indeed get rid of one of the e-pawn's defenders, but after 2 knight g3 f5, Black is unable to capture on e4 with his queen because the c3 knight still guards e4. This is because the c3 knight still exists. The proper sequence is for Black to take on c3 first, eliminating the c3 knight, and then to push the h-pawn. It's not enough to find the right moves. You must also play them in the right order. Which rook should Black move, the king rook or the queen rook? Incorrect. Seizing the d file with the king rook, 1 rook f8 d8, is surely a salubrious idea. It attacks White's queen and compels an answer, but it misses out on an opportunity by being too mechanical. That is, it's played because, as a rule of thumb, a player should seize an open file whenever he can do so with a gain time. But this is a general principle, which doesn't necessarily have application in the situation at hand. Still, White must respond to 1 rook f8 d8 with care. To avoid the stinger, rook a8 takes a3 and queen e7 takes b4 check, he'll have to move his queen to either b1 or c1, both of which are a little awkward because White's queen remains on the home rank. This might later on interfere with the process of connecting the rooks. Even so, White remains in the game after either deployment, after either queen d1 c1 or queen d1 b1. So maybe black should move the other rook. Correct. Moving the queen rook, 1 rook a8 takes a3, begins an undermining combination that plunders a pawn. If white takes back, 2 rook a1 takes a3, black's queen barrels through at b4. 2 queen e7 takes b4 check. This is a fork, which attacks the a3 rook and at the same time checks white's king. After white gets out of check, say 3 bishop g5 d2, black gobbles the a3 rook. 3 queen b4 takes a3. In the end, black gains 2 pawns. Should black take the bishop or move the knight? 1 bishop b6 takes e3, or 1 knight e4 takes f2. Incorrect. Taking the bishop, 1 bishop b6 takes e3, is not so bad, for after white takes back, 2 f2 takes e3, black has a number of targets to shoot at, including the pawn at d5 and the pawn at e3. Both of these come under fire after the retreat 2 knight e4 f6. Actually, black isn't retreating, he's advancing backward. But as good as exchanging on e3 is, black has even better. 1 knight e4 takes f2, and this is what he should play. Correct. The undermining blast, 1 knight e4 takes f2, forks queen and rook while removing the protection for the e3 bishop. White must take back. 2 king e1 takes f2, after which black bulldozes ahead with 2 bishop b6 takes e3 check, taking on e3 with the rook. 2 rook e8 takes e3, encounters white's undermining capture 3 knight a4 takes b6, which removes the rook's guard. Since trying to flee toward the king side, 3 king f2 g3 loses quickly via the queen check. 3 queen d8 d6 check. White is reduced to moving the king onto the e-file. 3 king f2 e2, for instance. This sets up a discovery from black's rook at e8, which enables black to acquire at least the exchange by 3 bishop e3 d4 check. White can save his king, say 4 king e2 d2, but he loses the rook at a1. 4 bishop d4 takes a1 in exchange for black's dark square bishop. 5 queen d1 takes a1. Should black move a rook or sack the queen? 1 rook h8 h7, or 1 queen d4 takes e4. Incorrect. White is threatening mate at b7, so guarding the pawn by b1 rook h8 h7 makes sense. This is an X-ray defense, in that the rook protects the square b7 through the white queen. But this misses an immediate win. In fact, even though black's move was wrong, it still kept the winning idea in the air, so white just can't play any old defensive move with his queen. He must be sure to retreat the queen to c4, which also bolsters the menaced e4 bishop, preventing black from playing a decisive sacrifice. 2 queen d4 takes e4. The things we have to do to avoid defeat. Correct. Black has a decisive blow. 1 queen d4 takes e4. This removes the defender of the h1 square. If white takes black's queen, 2 d3 takes e4, black forces mate in 2 moves by starting with a rook check on h1. 2 rook h6 h1 check. 3 king g1 g2, rook h8 h2 checkmate. And if white doesn't take black's queen, how does he intend to prevent murder on the cathedral square of h1? Should black defend the f-pawn or move it? 1. Bishop c8 e6 or 1 f7 f5? Correct. Defending the f-pawn, 1 bishop c8 e6 secures f7 while doing two other useful things. It develops a new piece, and more importantly it guards the queen, which otherwise is sitting out there unprotected, ripe for exploitation. Sometimes by playing a decent general move, you accidentally protect yourself against a specific unforeseen threat, such as life, and such as chess. Incorrect. The advance 1 f7 f5 is very aggressive. It tries to drive away white's knight so that black has the option of trading queens. The problem is that it doesn't deal with white's threat, and this is to move the e4 knight with a gain of time, unveiling a winning discovery to black's queen. The debacle is brought about by checking on f6, 2 knight e4 f6 check. True, black can take the knight for free, 2 g7 takes f6, but he can't find the time to save his queen, which falls victim to white's 3 queen f3 takes d5. Blind aggression 1 f7 f5 once again proves to be blind. Should white move the queen or attack black's queen? 1 queen d1 e2 or 1 bishop g5 takes f6? Correct. Black has a threat. It's to move the e5 knight, giving a discovery to white's king from black's queen. By placing white's own queen on e2, 1 queen d1 e2, white prevents the discovered check. The e5 knight can still be moved, but afterward black's queen will not be giving check. True, placing white's queen on e2, where it hampers the development of the f1 bishop, is typically unpleasant, but something has to be done to stop the discovery. Besides, black has a similar problem with his own queen. It too blocks in a bishop, the one occupying f8. It's usually better to be uncomfortable but alive than comfortable but chessically dead. Incorrect. The move 1 bishop g5 takes f6 seems to stop the action. It involves the taking of a piece in a way that attacks the enemy threatener. It therefore appears to gain time on black's queen, and it's this threat to black's queen that fools white into expecting a recapture on the square f6. But the discovery still works, and black ignores the threat to his own queen to garner white's king by the discovery 1 knight e5 f3 checkmate. This is a special kind of discovered check. It's called double check because two black pieces check white's king, the queen at e7, the stationary unit, and the knight at f3, the moving unit. Curiously, both the stationary and moving units are capturable by white's forces, but neither can be taken because the remaining one would still be giving check. In fact, there is no way for white to avoid the capture of his king on the next move. So it's checkmate, and the game is over. Should white take the pawn or the knight? 1 c4 takes d5 or 1 e3 takes f4? Correct. Taking the queen pawn, 1 c4 takes d5, gains a pawn, but white is already down a piece. This was the price he had to pay for drawing the black king to f7, where it's more exposed. After taking on d5, it's not clear that white has enough for his sacrificed material. But black is not yet out of the woods, and there are still problems to solve. For example, if black isn't careful, white may shortly be able to get away with capturing the knight on f4. Incorrect. Trying to regain the sacrificed piece by taking the f4 knight, 1 e3 takes f4, leads to trouble. It opens the e-file, exposing white's king to a deadly double check. Black makes one move and mates. 1, bishop e7, b4, checkmate. This issues two checks from the bishop and the rook, and that's mate. It's the awesomeness of this juggernaut force that has led many pundits to refer to double check as the most powerful move in chess. Should white advance a pawn or capture one? 1 g6, g7 check, or 1 g6, h7 check? Incorrect. Advancing the pawn, 1 g6, g7 check, looks very inviting. It gives a discovered check to black's king. Black can answer the threat by taking white's queen. 2 g7 takes h8, promote to queen. In the process, white has won and lost a queen and gained a rook. Black then acquires a rook himself. 2 bishop g2 takes h1. But the story isn't over, and white's attack may still win the day. The problem with this continuation is that it misses out on a greater one, and therefore it's the wrong answer. Correct. White has a forced mate in two moves. First, he takes on h7. 1 g6 takes h7 check, unleashing a discovered check from white's queen. The capture also destroys the protector of g6, the h7 pawn. White's queen goes down in the transaction. 1 knight f6 takes h5. But another diagonal power, the d3 bishop, assumes the reins, delivering an oblique mate at g6. 2 bishop d3, g6, checkmate. When the pieces are working harmoniously, there's always one ready to replace another. Should white move the queen bishop or take a pawn? 1 bishop c1 d2 or 1 knight c3 takes d5? Correct. Moving the queen bishop, 1 bishop c1 d2, develops a new piece, while strengthening the a5 e1 diagonal against possible checks. It also arms white with the threat to capture the d-pawn, which on this move was not feasible because of the counter-check on b4 from black's f8 bishop. A little preparation can go a long way. It might even threaten to win a pawn. Incorrect. Capturing the queen pawn, 1 knight c3 takes d5, is a blunder. It wins a pawn, but it loses the knight to 1 knight f6 takes d5. White can't follow through by taking back 2 queen b3 takes d5, for he runs into the discovery 2 bishop d6, b4 check. This is a check and must be respected. After white answers it, black can capture white's greedy queen for free. 3 queen d8 takes d5. Instead of taking on d5 immediately, white needs to prepare this capture by safeguarding the a5 e1 diagonal with 1 bishop c1 d2. Then he's ready for whatever life has to offer. Should white take on e5 with the queen or the knight? 1 queen e4 takes e5, or 1 knight f3 takes e5? Correct. Taking on e5 with the queen, one queen e4 takes e5, is an obvious blunder, for black simply pins the queen to its king by one rook d8 e8. Generally, you shouldn't commence operations on the king file with your king still on its original square. If the center opens, the regal one may have to abdicate before its time. But as bad as this capture, one queen e4 takes d5 is, it's better than the other choice, one knight f3 takes e5, which loses the game by force and in 3 moves to boot. Incorrect. Capturing on e5 with the knight, one knight f3 takes e5, is apparently risky, but white probably figures that he can survive by giving back the knight if he has to. So white doesn't fear the possibility of the knight getting pinned by one rook d8 e8. The problem is that black doesn't try to regain the material at all. Instead, he goes for bigger game, forcing mate with 2 king e1 takes d1. But this places the king on a vulnerable square, d1, where it's in line with black's d8 rook. Mate is then fashioned by giving the right double check, 2 bishop d7 g4 check. The wrong double check is 2 bishop d7 a4 check. White has 2 ways to go after 2 bishop d7 g4 check. He can sidle the king over to its original square, 3 king d1 e1, but then mate is delivered by the rook, 3 rook d8 d1 checkmate, which is protected by the bishop. If he instead moves the king up to c2, 3 king d1 c2, black pronounces mate with the bishop, 3 bishop g4 d1 checkmate, which is supported by the rook. This is great teamwork, and it's all set up by sacrificing the queen to give an unanswerable discovery. Should black avoid the queen trade or seek it? 1 bishop c8 e6, or 1 queen e7 takes e5? Incorrect. Many of us are overly fond of the queen, so we take every opportunity to avoid its exchange, sometimes even when the act of trading it confers advantage. But this is carrying a prejudice too far, as does the unexciting development 1 bishop c8 e6. It's a satisfactory move, all right. It develops toward the center, secures d5, and accomplishes its aim, the avoidance of a queen trade. But it's this very queen trade that gives black the win. Go back to the drawing board and play the other move. Correct. Exchanging queens, 1 queen e7 takes e5, may seem to wither away black's attack, but actually it fuels it. After white's compulsory recapture, 2 knight f3 takes e5, black issues the humiliating fork 2 bishop b6 d4. This attacks both white knights, as well as the rook at a1 by skewer, ensuring the gain of at least a piece. How often would a grand master trade queens just to win a healthy piece? All the time. Should black attack the pinned knight or take a pawn? 1 g7 g5, or take a pawn? Incorrect. It's true that white's knight at f4 is pinned to its queen by black's queen, but advancing the king-knight pawn, 1 g7 g5, doesn't guarantee winning the knight. For one, it's very risky to move the pawns in front of your own king. Moreover, once it's placed on g5, the pawn is also pinned by white's queen to black's king. Therefore, it can't yet capture on f4 anyway, which gives white the time for a spark of salvation, such as the thrust 2 h2 h4. This attacks the g-pawn while also giving the white king a flight square, in case it needs one. By the way, it does. Correct. Black should take a pawn all right, but not with the idea of gaining material. Say, rook e5 takes a5. Rather for the purpose of delivering mate in 2 moves, which is achieved by the brilliancy queen d4 takes f2 check. It's mate on the next turn, however white replies. Either white moves his king to the corner, king g1 h1, allowing the queen to mate by taking the unprotected rook, queen f2 takes f1 checkmate, or white's rook captures the queen, rook f1 takes f2, which leads to a back-rank checkmate from the e5 rook, rook e5, e1, checkmate. Why can't white's f2 rook retreat to block the check? Because it's pinned by the b6 bishop. Yes, the pin can be mightier than the sword. Should black take a pawn or attack a piece? c3 takes b2, or queen d8 b6. Incorrect. Black could try to gain a pawn by capturing on b2, c3 takes b2. But how does he continue after white takes back, bishop c1 takes b2? If he follows with the capture of the f6 pawn, e7 takes f6, white obtains counterplay by checking with his queen, queen d1 e2. Then, regardless how black blocks the check on e7, whether by queen d8 e7 or bishop f8 e7, white's b2 bishop will be able to take on f6, bishop b2 takes f6, and white is doing fine. Note that the piece black uses to block on e7 can't recapture on f6 because it's pinned by white's queen to black's king. A pin to the king is called an absolute pin. The pinned unit can't move off the line no matter what. A pin to any piece other than the king is known as a relative pin. In the case of a relative pin, the pinned unit can move off the line if the defender is willing to accept the consequences. After c3 takes b2, bishop c1 takes b2, the only other thing that black might try is to position the queen at b6, queen d8 b6, skewering the bishop on b5 and the bishop on b2. This is a terrific idea, but the timing is all wrong, and white can save himself by capturing on e7. f6 takes e7, attacking the f8 bishop while discovering an attack from the b2 bishop to the h8 rook. In this line, black is clearly not in the dominant position. Correct. The sly placement queen d8 b6 wins a piece. White finds himself facing a satanic skewer to the b5 bishop and the b2 pawn behind the bishop. If white moves his bishop to safety, say bishop b5 c4, black captures the b pawn, c3 takes b2, backed up by the queen. It's a fork, and there's no satisfactory way to salvage both the rook at a1 and the bishop at c1. For example, the counterpin rook a1 b1 is met directly by b2 takes c1 promote to queen, making a new queen and going up at least a piece. Taking black's b6 queen, rook b1 takes b6, doesn't help at this point, for after he trades the remaining queens, queen c1 takes d1 check, king e1 takes d1, black's fortunes rise by the addition of a rook via the recapture 5 a7 takes b6. But after 1 queen d8 b6, white does have another way he can try to avoid material loss. He could guard his bishop on b5. But however he does this, let's say by 2 queen d1 e2, black kicks the bishop with the a pawn, 2 a7 a6, and the same problems are still there. Nor does it help if white continues with the capture 3 f6 takes e7, for black is able to recapture on e7, 3 bishop f8 takes e7, and with careful play should escape additional injury. Meanwhile, white still drops a piece. Should black move a pawn or take a piece? 1. b4, b3, check, or take a piece. Incorrect. On the surface, black has a very menacing pawn move, 1, b4, b3, check. White's king would then have no place to go. But he does have a bishop guarding b3, and it's an extra bishop, so it could be sacrificed to break the force of black's attack. 2 bishop d5 takes b3, a4 takes b3, 3 king a2 takes b3. After this foray, white's king is no more vulnerable than black's, but white has 2 additional pawns, and this might soon begin to mean something, especially if black is forced to trade queens. For instance, after 3 queen d6 d1 check, 4 queen e2 takes d1, rook g1 takes d1, the ending is probably 1 for white. Correct. Taking a piece is the right idea. But which piece? You saw incisively if you played 1 queen d6 takes d5 check, removing the guard. This annihilates the protector of the b3 square, so that after white takes back 2 rook e5 takes d5, the advance 2 b4 b3 checkmate meets up with no resistance. It's mate, and that's that.